Okay. Thank you for coming back. We will now start our second session on new era of China-U.S. relations. Please welcome our moderator, Dr. Gao-Ying Mao, and speakers, Dr. James Auer, and discussants, Dr. Paris Chan. 咱要开始咱第二段的讨论，咱欢迎咱的高英茂先生。嘿。
大家欢迎大家来参加这个第二场的这个讨论。这个重点是这个美国甲中国的这个关系新发展，但是我想最重要也是有关这个整个这个亚太地区安全的问题。台湾安怎伫这个亚太地区会当继续生存？独立。有迄个主体性，我想这是咱上关心的问题。早起迄个柯世凯兄吼讲啊真清楚，我感觉这个是重点，咱爱对这个新政府的建议同时爱继续监督。即摆今仔日这个第二场吼，我想大家有看到两个大教授，这个Professor Auer from Vanderbilt，甲。这个中校生 Paris 张大教授来甲咱做这个主题演讲甲这个讨论但是伫这个以前吼，我要简单的讲几句话，将这一场讨论的迄个重点吼，佮甲各位报告一下。因为我拄仔原仔点到吼，咱的这个生存甲独立，这个是我上关心的代志啦。其他安怎甲这个世界的强权配合？其他安怎对这个两岸关系，维持这个和平的关系？我想这个是重要，但是应该是次要。所以对这个观点看啦，我是感觉目前伫这个亚太地区，尤其是这个东海、南海。发生的这上重要的代志，就是这个世界两个强权的竞争啦，这是实质啦。这个中国或者我迄个国语吼，这个中国的崛起啦，我想这个是全世界上大的代志啦。这可以会使讲是第二次这个世界大战了。以后的这个叫做第二次的冷战的开始，这点伫美国原来认为真重要，所以中国即摆伫遮咧发展迄个叫做啥一带一路的关系，伫迄个南海，伫咧发展伊的这个军事基地等等，美国不得不来正面的回应就是讲 ，OK， 那照这个。差不多2011年以后的这个口号，就是 pivot to Asia， 爱转来亚洲来重新甲这个崛起的中国来平衡。这个要安怎做？台湾的角色是伫倒？为着咱的生存甲独立是伫倒？我想这个是真大的挑战。来第二最近较小挑战，但是原来真重要，就是这个南海问题。这南海，你老讲即摆规个遐拢叫做历史化甲甲军事化。历史化就是这个叫做九段，这个是中国的内海，伊要控制这个航运甲这个太空，另外就是讲，这个九段以外，伊开始伫迄个伊控制的迄个叫做 rocks 礁拢咧。建立军事基地，包括飞机场甲这个迄个 missile 飞弹，这个意义伫倒？对台湾的意义伫倒？对美国的意义伫倒？我想这个更较重要。这个规个，你若讲南海甲东海拢中国来控制，我想这个叫做第一岛链、第二岛链，伊就冲破了。尤其是台湾的立场是安怎更较重要？我今仔日我是。感慨良深呐，咱政府新政府定来咧讲，按照迄个国际法，按照迄个联合国的迄个海洋法， 规定来处理，但是迄个模糊地带真侪啦。咱即摆的立场真侪拢甲老共差不多啦。吼，你若对迄个历史的角度来看，差不多。啊，即个到底是咱的政策是对？啊，你即摆迄个美国甲日本采取遮强硬的政策，要来维持南海的即个航海甲迄个飞行的自由。啊，到底吼，伊即摆即个7月12有即个迄个世界的即个仲裁法院，吼讲即个吼9段线啦，吼要控制即个航空甲航海，拢是违反法律，吼即个是一个国际仲裁法院的决定，到底咱台湾的政策是对？我也感觉。吼，当然有人讲都爱模糊啦，但是模糊的当时甲咱的生存、甲咱的将来关系真大。所以我是讲，这几点吼，向各位先报告。这次的这个咱的国际会议，其实真重要。对我来讲，就是对这上基本的问题爱厘清啦。吼，咱甲美国的关系、甲日本的关系，到底是要站在同一边？还是讲，互咱要站在模糊的地带，或者所谓迄个或者像维持现状。这现状是啥物物件？其实这现状是不合逻辑的这个讲法啦。世界拢伫咧变化，台湾也在变化，海峡也在变化。你这现状是伫对？啥物叫做现状？所以我是讲，我感慨良深啦。所以这几点吼，先报告。今仔日。咱两个大教授吼，这是毋是普通的教授？因吼除了讲学术以外，学术专家以外，对这实际的工作，实际的这个战略的参与拢真侪。所以我就要强调，这个Professor Auer， 伊吼有差不多50档的这个。历史 I wouldn't say anything negative to you, so you can feel at ease. All right. 伊50档的这个经验吼，专业的经验一半差不多25档，伊是伫美国的海军甲日本的这个海军的合作，实际工作对这个做真侪。来25档就是伫Vanderbilt。创建立迄个做日美的迄个研究甲合作中心，伊训练真侪人。所以吼，伊日本天皇吼，伫2008年该征询啦，吼，像日本的产経新聞吼是真重要，甲征询。所以对这点来看吼，我想 Professor Auer 伊的经验甲伊的学术的观点吼。对咱真重要。So without further ado, Professor Auer, OK， 欢迎，鼓掌欢迎。
Thank you very much, Michael, for your very kind, nothing negative introduction. And it's a very great honor to be on the dais with Michael Gao and Dr. Chang. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Taiwan National Security Institute for inviting me to speak here today. More than 40 years ago, in Tokyo, I was introduced to Dr. Yuzen Chaotong-ng, chairman of WUFI, who later founded the Taiwan National Security Institute, who became a mentor to me during many subsequent meetings in Taiwan. I am honored but hesitant to speak today without his hand resting on my shoulder. I apologize to him up in heaven and to the audience for my unworthiness. I was asked to speak about recent developments of American policy on China and international cooperation among Taiwan, Japan, and the U.S. Recently, Ms. Meirei Ong gave me a wonderful book about Taiwan's history written by her father. I was going to summarize my simplistic understanding of it, but you all know Taiwan history better than I, so I skip it. But I enjoyed the book, Ms. Ong, so much and learned very much. I first visited Taiwan in 1963 as an ensign in the U.S. Navy. From the port of Keelung, I traveled to Taipei, where it sometimes seemed there were either soldiers or policemen on many street corners, and large numbers of signs extorting return to the mainland. A few years later, I spent 5 days in Taipei recuperating from an illness, pneumonia, I had contacted in Japan. On the first night at the Officers Club, I met a newly married major in the Republic of China Army who was having dinner with his new wife. We enjoyed talking so much that we agreed to meet again on Friday night before my departure to go back to Japan. On that second meeting, we drank a little more wine, and I asked about the return to mainland signs. He explained that he was a relatively rare native Taiwanese officer, whereas most of the Republic of China military officers were mainlanders who came with Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. He explained that virtually all of the soldiers were native Taiwanese who had no desire to leave Taiwan. In response to my question as to what would happen if the order to return to the mainland were suddenly given, he said, "The soldiers, who are Taiwanese, have guns, but no bullets, ammunition. If ordered," he said, "they would go to the beaches, receive ammunition from the officers, shoot the officers, and return to their homes in Taiwan." I was indeed touched by his candor, which impressed me as his true conviction. In 1969, the United States succeeded in persuading its Japanese ally to join in stating the security of Taiwan was one of the most important factors for Japan, which implied that Tokyo would take a positive attitude towards the use of U.S. bases in Japan should armed conflict occur in the Taiwan area. However, that came to an end when U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China without consultation with Tokyo. A shocked Japan proceeded to recognize the Beijing government. Looking back, it seems to me both Washington and Tokyo got China fever while neglecting to keep in mind the will of the Taiwanese people. The U.S. and Japan did, however, cooperate closely together in deterring a massive Soviet military buildup in its Asian provinces and in the Western Pacific in the 1970s. In the initial 2 decades of the Cold War, the majority of Soviet conventional and nuclear forces were based in European Russia. However, in the 1970s, embarrassed by its loss of face during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the USSR began to increase its overall naval forces, including then its Asian force levels as well, particularly its Pacific Fleet based in Vladivostok, in close proximity to the Japanese mainland across the Sea of Japan. By the end of the decade of the 1970s, the Soviets had 100 submarines in their Pacific Fleet alone. 40% of these were nuclear powered, and some carried intercontinental ballistic missiles. The threat was almost unimaginable. The U.S. Navy had more than 200 sophisticated anti-submarine warfare P-3 aircraft, but because of worldwide responsibilities, the U.S. could only keep approximately 25 of them with the 7th Fleet in the Western Pacific. What could have been a very dangerous situation for Japanese and American security was avoided because through the 1980s, Japan was able to expand and operate its naval anti-submarine air fleet to 100 high-technology P-3 aircraft. Virtually every Soviet submarine which departed from Vladivostok or from Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula and entered the Sea of Japan or the Pacific Ocean was detected and monitored by a Japanese or American P-3, whose computers could talk to each other in real time via encrypted data link communications. Once detected, each Soviet submarine had to report to its headquarters that it had been located by a Japanese or an American aircraft. Given the much larger Japanese P-3 numbers, the majority of Soviet submarines detected were monitored by Japanese naval aircraft. These detections significantly complicated Soviet military planning, since the USSR High Command had to recognize that if the locations of its submarines were known, the U.S. had the capability to sink them if the Cold War went hot. The Soviets spent a huge amount of money building their submarine fleet, but the anticipated political advantages therefrom never materialized because of the highly effective monitoring actions of Japanese and American naval aircraft. Owing to the geographic environment of Northeast Asia and the deployment of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force and U.S. Navy P-3 aircraft at bases in mainland Japan and Okinawa, it appeared the Soviet Union's Navy was effectively contained. Clearly, surveillance and monitoring of the Soviet Pacific Fleet was extraordinarily effective and had the powerful effect of preventing Moscow from controlling the sea lanes of the Northwest Pacific. But war was never declared, so the Soviet submarine or surface fleets were not prevented from operating in the Sea of Japan and beyond. Thus, it is probably more correct to say that rather than being contained, the continental USSR's Pacific Fleet was geographically disadvantaged. The seamless Navy-to-Navy cooperation by 1990 with the fall of the Soviet Union resulted in a great Japanese and American naval victory in the Pacific by deterrence. The victory was made possible because, despite the huge numbers of Soviet submarines, the U.S. and Japanese navies maintained control of the seas of the Western Pacific. The late Japanese Grand Strategist, Ambassador Hisahiko Okazaki, who Dr. Lowe and David and many of you know very well, called the naval victory by deterrence the unknown Japan-U.S. success story. In 1990, the last year of the Cold War, the U.S. maintained about 240,000 military personnel in Western Europe. The great majority of this large number was in West Germany as a deterrent against a massive Soviet-led Warsaw Pact conventional attack, with tanks through the Fulda Gap in Germany, which is roughly the route along which Napoleon chose to withdraw his armies from Russia after defeat at the Battle of Leipzig. In the same year, 1990, the U.S. had 100,000 military forces in the Western Pacific, about half of which were in Japan, and the remainders were in South Korea and at sea with the U.S. 7th Fleet headquartered in Yokosuka, Japan. Today, as I speak here, there are less than 100,000 U.S. military personnel in Western Europe. However, the number in the Western Pacific is almost the same, 100,000, as at the end of the Cold War, and is possibly a little larger. You will see a figure in a moment. Why such a big difference between the huge reduction in Europe and the maintenance of the status quo, or even an increase in the Asian Pacific? In 1994, a few years after the end of the Cold War, I attended a conference in Seoul, South Korea, on the role of the U.S.-Japan alliance following the demise of the Soviet Union. In addition to Korean organizers of the conference, there were participants from Japan, China, Russia, and the United States, of which I was one. Unfortunately, there was no one from Taiwan invited. All participants in attendance agreed that the alliance was very important and necessary during the Cold War. Even the Russian participant from academia agreed, and with the exception of a Chinese representative, all agreed that the alliance should continue as a necessary guarantee of peace and stability in the post-war Asia-Pacific region, post-Cold War Asia-Pacific region. In dissent, one Chinese participant argued that the Soviet Union was indeed, to use former U.S. President Ronald Reagan's term, an evil empire. However, he added, the Soviet bear had now passed away. China, he asserted, is a peace-loving country, and therefore there was no longer any need for the presence of U.S. military forces in Japan and South Korea. The U.S. can just go home, he said, and the Asian Pacific will remain peaceful. In the case of Europe, the Chinese spokesman in Seoul in 1994 was correct. The Soviet threat of a large land invasion had largely disappeared, and indeed the Soviet submarine threat from Vladivostok had been seriously reduced as well. However, unlike the situation in Europe, with the fall of the USSR and the democratization of the Warsaw Pact nations, in Asia, North Korea and China remained as communist countries led by non-democratic, authoritarian governments. In a new joint statement of the U.S.-Japan Security Consultative Committee, so-called 2+2, of February 2005, Washington and Tokyo called for measures to encourage the peaceful resolution of issues concerning the Taiwan Strait through dialogue as a common strategic objective. This statement about Taiwan, after a silence and neglect for over 30 years, has strong significance for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan's democratization and the PRC's reaction to it had indeed made the U.S. and Japan take notice. The post-Cold War question for Tokyo and for Washington, in my opinion, is whether the Japanese and U.S. navies can simultaneously deter China from aggressive acts of war as they did vis-a-vis the Soviet Pacific Fleet in the 1980s. A related question for me is, how can Taiwan most meaningfully and cost-effectively provide for its own self-defense? Continental China would no doubt like to restore the China-centric tributary system of the past, but if the U.S. and Taiwan are determined enough, geography and Chinese behavior argue against Chinese hegemony, given the proximity of Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, and India. All of these countries are concerned, to say the least, by China's aggressive behavior and Beijing's claims, which are contrary to international law. Since it is now not at war, China is able to operate in the East and South China Seas and beyond. Indeed, to make its economy prosper, China needs to import energy and raw materials and to export finished products by sea. But rather than dominating or controlling Southern Pacific commerce and military activities, China's geography will limit its capabilities unless major Pacific powers, led by Japan and the United States, and including the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia, Taiwan, and India, needlessly allow China to violate international law by taking control of Taiwan, the Senkaku Islands, and other territories China claims by force, and by limiting or prohibiting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. The so-called First Island Chain, you will see a map in a moment, extends from south from Kyushu through Japan's Southwest Islands, Taiwan, the Philippines, Brunei, and Malaysia, and ends off the coast of Vietnam. The second island chain extends from central Japan island of Honshu along the Bonin Islands, Mariana Islands, and Caroline Islands to New Guinea. Japan's military bases in Kyushu and Okinawa anchor the northern part of the First Island Chain. In 2014, the United States and the Philippines negotiated an enhanced defense cooperation agreement allowing the U.S. to operate forces in the Philippines for extended periods of time. This agreement has been upheld as constitutional by the Philippine Supreme Court in January 2016. Similarly, the United States and Japan have reached agreements with Vietnam allowing ship visits and air operations from Vietnamese bases. And in January of this year, then Japanese Defense Minister Nakatani explained that Japanese P-3 aircraft returning from anti-piracy patrols off Somalia would stop in the Philippines. At the APEC summit in Manila on November 19, 2015, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe expressed support for U.S. patrol activities in the South China Sea and hinted to President Obama that it was his intention to look into the possibility of the Japan Self-Defense Forces conducting operations in the area. Although Defense Minister Nakatani and the Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga emphasized shortly thereafter that there were no current plans to do so, Japan's top military advisor to the Prime Minister, Admiral Kazutoshi Kawano, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Self-Defense Fleet, Vice Admiral Yasuhiro Shigeoka, have stated publicly that the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces have the capability of operating with the U.S. 7th Fleet in the South China Sea. It is certain that China knows this as well. If the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force and the U.S. Navy can, for example, demonstrate the capability in the case of Chinese initiation of the use of military force against Taiwan to deny China use of the sea inside the first island chain, to defend the sea and airspace of the first island chain, and to dominate the sea and maritime areas outside of the first island chain, their ability to do so would be a meaningful deterrent to Chinese illegal aggression, or more powerful than was the Japanese-American deterrent, which complicated Soviet military planning and therefore stopped Soviet aggression from occurring during the Cold War. Of course, in the case of a direct armed attack, Taiwan must lead its own self-defense. It cannot move its location a great distance from the Chinese East Coast, and it cannot outspend or even match China's military expenditures. But Taiwan can do two things if it thinks bigger and acts smarter. One of these is to foster interoperability with American and Japanese defense forces. And the second is to utilize relatively cheap, especially when compared to expensive mainline defense systems such as missile submarines and sophisticated fighter aircraft, new technology to challenge Chinese tactical dominance. Taiwan has wisely procured an anti-submarine warfare operations center, ASWAC, capability for its P-3C aircraft, which can render them interoperable with the large Japanese and American anti-submarine aircraft, which so effectively deterred the Soviet Pacific Fleet during the Cold War. Possessing this expensive but cost-effective command and control system, Taiwan can directly link its P-3s to the Japanese-American Pacific anti-submarine network. As far as dealing directly in response to Chinese military strength, Dr. T.X. Hammes, Distinguished Research Fellow of the Center for Strategic Research at the Center for Strategic Research Institute for National Security Studies at the U.S. National Defense University, has pointed out the following in a 2016 article earlier this year. To quote from Dr. Hammes's article, "The convergence of dramatic improvements in the field of robotics, artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, and nanoenergetics is dramatically changing the character of conflict in all domains. This convergence is creating a massive increase in capabilities available to increasingly smaller political entities. This new definition of power has major implications for the conduct of warfare, not the least of which are the major hazards or opportunities that these technologies present to medium and even small powers. The outcome will depend on the path they choose." End of quote from Dr. Hammes' article. What is also urgently needed from the USA is an American-led Pacific strategy, which all of China's neighbors earnestly hope for, but unfortunately, in my opinion, is currently lacking owing to a lack of U.S. leadership. This is not my personal view alone. In the unclassified position of an impressively detailed classified January 2016 report mandated by the U.S. Congress, the prestigious non-political bipartisan Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS in Washington, D.C., pointed out the desperate need for a U.S.-led Pacific strategy beyond the well-intentioned Asia rebalance announced by President Obama in 2011. Although progress in designing and putting such a strategy has not proceeded as fast as it could have, and indeed, in my opinion, not nearly as fast as it should have, it is not too late. China complains because it recognizes Japanese and American capabilities are in existence, and the likelihood of a credible state of deterrence would become more real if Japan and the U.S. take the necessary steps to empower their navies further. In the case of Taiwan, again quoting from Dr. Hammes, in contrast to the ever more expensive, extremely high technology systems, small, smart, and relatively cheap UAVs creating entirely new challenges across the battlefield. While current U.S. high technology programs produce fewer and fewer custom-built weapon systems, the convergence of technological advances is resulting in a proliferation of tens of thousands of cheap, smart weapons. For small and medium nations, the idea of a small, smart, and many represents a great opportunity for their investment programs. They can generate many of the capabilities of the most expensive current systems at a fraction of the cost. They may also be shifting of the balance to the tactical defensive, which would allow a smaller power to employ effective, affordable, anti-access, area denial, A2AD, capability against a much larger power. The critical military functions will remain, but how they will be accommodated will change. Rather than investing everything in a few exquisite and very expensive systems, it makes more sense to explore augmenting them and in time replacing them with systems that are small, smart, and inexpensive. End of quote from Dr. Hammes. If Taiwan, Japan, and the U.S. do more than is necessary, it's not dangerous. But if Japan, the U.S., and Taiwan do too little, or if the credibility of using Taiwanese, American, and Japanese resolve, if military challenged by China, is not clearly demonstrated, Beijing may get overconfident and attempt to achieve its hegemonic goals militarily. It's very necessary to complicate an enemy's planning, just as the U.S. and Japanese navies did to the Soviet Union's Pacific forces during the Cold War. Please allow me a final story. 3 political heroes of my lifetime are American President Ronald Reagan, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Taiwan President Lee Teng-hui. President Lee is the only one of the 3 I have ever met in person. When I did so in Tokyo, I offered him my opinion that Taiwan should exercise rather than declare its independence, despite all the difficulties of the current situation, because a declaration would be waving a red handkerchief in the face of an angry bull. But I was never comfortable with myself to not empathize sufficiently with President Lee's sincere convictions. On my way back from Taipei this April, I came across the unofficial motto of Stanford University in California, which is affixed to its seal in the German language. In German, Die Luft der Freiheit weht. This acts as Stanford's creed and translates to English as the wind of freedom blows. It was chosen by Stanford's first president in the mid-1800s and dates from a 16th century saying of a German scholar and reformer who coined the phrase in Latin. In closing, I'd like to say that I believe Taiwanese very much have the right to say proudly, Zigyo Chi Feng Trei Fu, and that the people of free nations should have the honesty to say that in Taiwan today, the wind of freedom truly blows mightily. I feel sure Dr. Ng would have proudly said so had he lived to see the results of the January 2016 elections in Taiwan. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Wonderful. 谢谢. Thank you very much. Now, in the interest of time, we will turn to Professor Paris Zhang. 那个中学生唔免介绍啦，大家拢知影吼。不过我是爱要讲吼，伊这是以前台的同学啦，以后伊去 Columbia 了就去迄个 Penn State 做教授。其实伊的迄个 career 吼，伊的迄个专业吼。其實甲迄個 Professor Auer 小可共款啦，伊差不多30幾冬嘅時間佇迄個美國，尤其是佇迄個 Penn State 吼。但是以後伊原來差不多有20冬嘅時間，返來台灣為台灣奉獻，做即個立法委員，做即個國安會副秘書長，閣再做大使等等。所以張學成也張教授 ，OK？Is it working? Yeah. Oh.
Thank you. 我要讲的吼，中文甲英文吼，10日前咧交互这个主办单位，也无甲印落遮啦。啊，这阮各位有睇到无？有吼 ，OK。What I'm going to say is in the paper, both in English and Chinese. I'm sure you got a copy, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. No, it's a paper. Okay, yeah. All right. I'm going to say a few words in my mother tongue, and then I'll speak in English, okay? 这个我今仔日吼要讲的话吼，中英文啊拢有写在这个这款吼纸，大家可能有看到啦吼。我较挂我有一寡这个 PowerPoint 这重点吼底下我用英文吼这款来表达吼，我对伊这篇论文甲一寡想法啦吼。你请这个这款我等下要上吼，这款我倒听一下，因为我有问题要甲伊讲吼。叫精神起来呀OK. All right. Professor Auer, I read your paper several times. I agree very much with your point, and your concern about U.S. policy rebalance, but you're concerned with the lack of leadership. Yeah. Well, we are concerned about American leadership too. In the last several days, U.S. President, his national security team, sent a message to the Pentagon, gagging, asking all these military leaders not to talk about major power competition. You must be surprised. 我甲讲，伊真正关心这个这款吼美国的重返亚太这个策略啦。我真同意这观点，确实呢，美国缺少这个这款领导啦，唔知影丧失朋友，丧失敌人。但几日前，美国的国安会啦，上一个这款信息，这个五角大厦，甲五角大厦的这这款主管。讲以后恁演讲唔通讲大国的这个竞争啦，安尼得罪中国啦。And that was very curious. And Senator Cotton, in the Military Affairs Committee, in a hearing, he asked Chief of Staff and also the Naval Chief. You agree? Are we in major power competition? They will say, yes, of course. And so you can see that you got program leadership, and fortunately, we are going to get new leadership next January. So soon may be changing, hopefully. Okay? So, 这个美国的国安会啦吼，伊有这款甲遮个将领讲，以后恁公开演讲吼，莫讲咱甲中国是安尼大国的竞争啦，安尼互中国这款无欢喜。但是呢，咱拢知影讲吼，美国的这个五角大厦甲遮海军的将领，大家对中国的这个南海、东海的这个活动吼，这款因真无欢喜，所以呢。美国有真侪行动，但是因的国安会、因的总统惊得罪中国，这是有这款真无这正确的代志。总是呢，明年1月有新的这个美国总统，咱希望讲这个因未来有这新的这政策。I want to call your attention about U.S. Policymakers. Here's a new book, Pivot. By Cole Campbell, former Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific, and he, Secretary of State, of course, yeah. 我讲即马打 一本册出来，我伫读啦吼。这本册的作者叫做柯坎姆，伊有这款甲这个3年前，伊是美国国务院亚太的这个助理国务卿，可能下一任，假定讲克林顿希拉里克林顿做总统的时阵，伊是国务卿啦，这伊有这款对美国这个 pivot 重返亚太这个政策。这个叙述啦，伫这本册内底，对这个小英这款去年6月的华府演讲真正欧络，伊认为讲这款小英做的事情很好，所以咱希望讲未来这个美国的这个政策这款行较对的路啦My own perception of U.S. pivot, one of the fault. Is failure to recognize the importance of Taiwan and its strategic role could play, and hopefully this kind of a mistake will be corrected. 美國這關到目前即重返亞太策略最大的錯誤是無認識台灣戰略的重要性，無認講台灣真正確實會當扮演重要嘅角色。希望講未來新的總統。这款美国的新的这个总统改变这款的错误的这个策略。Okay, I wrote this paper well for you, thinking that you might be able to tell your American friends this is time to really reset U.S.-Taiwan relations. All right, we can have the PowerPoint. All right. 第一个了U.S. Congress the last several months have adopted so-called concurrent resolution saying that the Taiwan Relation Act and the 6 reassurances are the cornerstone of U.S.-Taiwan relations. Why? The Congress did that because Congress was not happy with the Obama administration. It did not faithfully carry out provision of Taiwan Relation Act. So this particular act by the Congress is very important. 所以美國這關國會這幾個月前這關通過這共同的國際法案，用這台灣關係法甲6大保證，這是美國對台灣政策的這重要基礎啦。是安怎伊提出這法案？因為奧巴馬administration甲奧巴馬政府講啦，講你無認真執行嘛，這個法律美國的法律你無認真執行，所以這個有這關政治上的意義真重大。這是第一點，這關我要講的表達部分。Okay, then since U.S. is going to have a new president next January in office, it's time for us, for you, to try to work on normalization of U.S.-Taiwan relations. 新的美台關係正常化，應該這關都要努力來推動。台灣也好，美國的朋友也好。Okay, next. 檢討這個美台關係，這是第一步啦。22當前，這關克林頓的政府有這個這關第一過的這檢討，迄過檢討，咱台灣的政府、國民黨的政府無參與啦，是無應該，無參與。所以咱得到啥物？得到一個，咱所得到是講迄過的美國的這個這關咱的代表處的名為這個 CCN 的北美協調會變做台北文化經濟代表處，敢若迄個名。但是呢，最大的傷害是這個克林頓政府宣布講此後，這是1994年，此後 美國無要支持台灣參與聯合國，甲其他以國家為單位的這個國際關係啦。這點對這款台灣真大傷害。在座蔡明憲，這款前國防部長，伊當帶一隊幾啊檔啦，去這美國宣達講台灣要加入聯合國。此後呢，咱愛甲美國的政府講你無支持台灣加入聯合國，這是違反恁的台灣關係法。台灣關係法有一個條文，真正清楚講美國應該支持台灣參加國際組織。台灣有少數的人了解這點，咱的外交部長李大為，伊的這個博士論文的內底，有寫起講美國這台灣關係法是支持台灣參加國際組織，所以此後呢，咱對美國的這個外交應該所以講強調講，恁若無支持台灣參加聯合國甲其他國際組織的時陣，你是違反恁家己的法律，所以這是咱的新的這個論述。So anyway, we are going to ask the United States to be more proactive, supporting Taiwan's participation in the United Nations and other international organizations. Also, Taiwan's security is a very important matter to the United States. Yet, the current Obama administration and before even George W. Bush administration and Carter, Clinton, they all failed to implement the provision of Taiwan Relation Act. And this is something we ought to call their attention. And we have to rework closer together with US Congress to alert them when the administration failed to carry out to implement the provision, security provision of Taiwan Relation Act. And finally, it's time for Taiwan and the United States really to normalize relations. 1979, Carter administration derecognized the Republic of China in Taiwan under Kuomintang. Kuomintang was authoritarian regime then, but still the Congress adopted the Taiwan Relation Act because Taiwan is so important. And today, after 37 years, Taiwan is a democracy. Everyone says that, well, even American officials, member of Congress, they all say Taiwan is a landmark. Taiwan is a really model of Asian Pacific. Yet, Taiwan is treated as nobody. If Cuba can be, United States can normalize relations with, why not Taiwan? Taiwan is so important. And therefore, we want United States, American friends who are concerned about Taiwan. And of course, here, well, our Taiwanese people, we have to work to get the new administration in the United States really think about how to, well, upgrade the relation with Taiwan. And this is very important. And your paper talk about how can United States, Taiwan, and Japan work together. And this is something I want to propose. Because in Dr. Watanabe's paper, he also asked about the suggestion, proposition from Taiwan as to how could we work together. Well, Taiwan considers submarines very important. These are deterrent weapons. Yet, for Taiwan to try to manufacture it, costs too much money, take too long. And whether it is possible, decommissioned Japanese submarine could be sold to Taiwan, and we can get it. We can get the United States to be involved also. The United States could try to upgrade it, and so combat system. So in this way, Taiwan's deterrent capability could be greatly strengthened. And since Japan considers Taiwan's security is an integral part of Japan's security. We hope that Japan will be willing to work together on this. Japan may be reluctant to sell decommissioned sub to Taiwan directly, but they could sell to the United States and upgrade it with a U.S. combat system and other things, and then sold back to Taiwan. So in this way, Taiwan's defense capability could be greatly strengthened. So this is the kind of suggestion I like to make to our Japanese friend, and I also want to hear your feedback. Thank you. 多謝。
多謝Paris 桑。我想今仔日這個論文發表人吼，甲這個討論人吼，我想攏有真好的這個建議啦。尤其是這個論文的這個討論人吼，對as Paris suggested many critical questions for the American side. I think we still have quite a few minutes left. I would like to see some sort of a Q&A at the end. But first, I think since Paris raised some critical questions about U.S. policy, I wonder if Professor Auer, you want to respond first?
I think is this okay? Yeah. I mentioned at the end of my speech the Stanford University slogan, which I heard about from many years ago, but I heard about it the first time in April of this year. But much more recently, I heard something much, much better. This morning, for the first time, I met President Tsai, just for a few seconds. And I told her, your interview in the American newspaper Wall Street Journal was wonderful. On Wednesday, I left Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, to come here to Taipei. And sitting in the airplane, I read the interview with President Tsai by the Wall Street Journal. I got so excited. She said, Taiwan is a sovereign, independent nation. This is very different from Hong Kong. Hong Kong wants to be democratic, but China is frustrating Hong Kong's desire. But in the case of Taiwan, Taiwan is now sovereign, independent nation, and that cannot be changed without the will of the Taiwanese people, which I completely agree with, and I'm sure you do too. I have never understood so-called 1992 consensus. So I would like to propose new 2016, not consensus, but reality. The reality is China is one independent, sovereign nation, but it's a dictatorship governed by the People's Republic of China. Taiwan, as the President said, is one sovereign, independent nation, which is democratic and cannot be changed without the will of the Taiwanese people. This should be the reality of 2016. And I hope the United States and Japanese government will read President Tsai's interview and have some guts like she has.
我想我们假如在现在台下有这个非常这个 urgent 的这种 question 觉得非常重要紧迫的这个问题我想可以提出来，让 Professor Auer 跟 Professor 张也有简单我们对话的机会。所以现在这位先。
To continue the question that Professor Zhang just raised, in early this year, since the Taiwan Defense Department tried to build our own submarine, It takes 23 years and 400 billion NT dollar. So I propose currently there are 39 submarines in Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, Guam, and Japan. There are more than 15 nuclear power submarines. It's going to be decommissioned. Like next year, the one in Los Angeles, Great Buffalo, is going to decommission from Pearl Harbor. The other one, Olympia, is going to decommission from Guam. So, Professor Auer, can you comment, is it possible for Taiwan to take the decommissioned submarine as a waste recycling program for the U.S. Navy?
If I am the U.S. Congress or President, I will say yes. But it's difficult. But maybe it's not completely necessary. I mentioned in my talk how the U.S. and Japanese navies very successfully deterred huge number of Soviet submarines during the Cold War by working together. Recently, South Korea purchased anti-submarine aircraft, P-3C aircraft, but they didn't purchase command and control system, so they're useless. They can only work with themselves, and their number is too small. Taiwan is going to have P-3C aircraft, but they bought the command and control system, ASWAC. As a result, Taiwan can use, if the American and Japanese government agree, all of the P-3C aircraft of U.S. Navy and Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force free. That's the kind of strategy we ought to have. And again, Taiwan's defense budget will always be limited. So I think Japan, the United States, and Taiwan should just sit together how to have the most effective combined defense. We don't have a new U.S.-Japan-Taiwan alliance, but I think we can have a virtual Taiwan-U.S.-Japan alliance. But we need to talk to each other. And the military leaders of Japan and the United States perfectly understand the military importance of Taiwan. And I hope the new president of the United States, be it Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, will understand how important Taiwan is. But I think we can work together much better than we have. Obama thought his pivot strategy would be effective, but it hasn't been strong enough, in my opinion, and I think Dr. Chang agrees with me.
All right. In that sense, Dr. Chang?
No nuclear submarine. It has the diesel. And I'm saying that, well, there are decommissioned submarine in Japan, in Italy, and many other places. But we are hoping Japan, and I think, Watanabe-san, are you awake? So, well, hopefully, when you go back to Japan, work on this prospect for Japanese decommissioned submarine to be sold to the United States. United States would upgrade it with a U.S. commerce system, and then U.S. would sell that to Taiwan. I think it save time and also save money for Taiwan. And because your paper talk about a cooperation between Japan and Taiwan, you ask for suggestion, and I'm making a suggestion to you. Okay.
But if, I completely agree. And if Taiwan, Japan, and the United States perform a virtual alliance, Japanese and American submarines will be used to defend Taiwan freely, for free. Very good bargain.
这个我很感动的，因为那个 Professor Auer， 他这个不但就是说要加强我们的军力啊，也想替我们省钱呢。这个 You are very kind to be very.
I'm very selfish. I like Taiwan, but the reason it's very important for the United States, if China takes Taiwan, next they will take Senkaku Islands, next they will take Okinawa, then freedom of sea in the Pacific Ocean. will be compromised. So the United States should defend Japan for the national interest of the United States, and Japan should defend Taiwan for the national interest of Japan. And I think our politicians understand that, or they should understand it, but like President Tsai, they are not brave enough to say so.
好，谢谢。我们也许在一个question， 在一个问题有没有？哦，这边后面有一位。
听问者吼，这菲律宾的总统对美国的态度吼，会影响即马这个南海，还是这个亚太的这个和平
Okay, the question is, recently you may have noticed that the new Filipino president, Duterte, seems to be making a lot of noise, particularly, condemning the United States and changing its policy. Now, the question is whether you have response to that.
Taiwan should take care of him.
台湾爱去处理这个新总统，这个我也感觉不可思议啦。伊所以你若美国啦将来佫选到这个 Trump 出来我想完全不可思议。
Well, the next U.S. president will be Hillary Clinton. That's very much for sure. And China considers her a troublemaker because she's very tough against China. And to be exact, July 25th, 2010, in Hanoi, Hillary Clinton was the first to raise the issue of China's expansionism and its hegemonic act in South China Sea. And Hillary said that, peaceful resolution of conflict and freedom of navigation is to U.S. national interest. And many nations responded favorably to what she has to say. And so China afraid of Hillary Clinton, and she is going to be tough against China. That's the way I say it. 我讲这关美国下一任的总统应该是 Clinton 啦 ，Hillary 中国是这关足惊伊啦，足无爱伊的啦，伊认为讲伊是这关麻烦制造者啦，troublemaker。我讲2010年的7月25啦，在汉诺越南，在开会时阵，希拉里首先就讲中国的这行为是这款无符合这款美国的利益，甲其他的国家大家也无赞成，叫这款中国应该这真个代志爱和平解决，袂当靠中国说了算一款的这态度啦。所以假定讲这个希拉里做总统的时阵我相信呢，对南海的这个问题应该这款会真正这款坚决啦。毕竟这个所谓 pivot 是 rebalancing 这个重返亚太这个策略，希拉里这个2011年10月25的这个文章啦美国的亚洲的世纪这篇文章的内底重返亚太，这是希拉里的这真正坚强的这政策甲伊的信用。所以假定讲伊未来做总统的时阵，对台湾原来真好，因为甲台湾讲恁甲中国经济上遮依赖中国，恁的经济无法度自主，政治也无法度自主，所以讲这话的意思就是讲，台湾唔通干那挖为中国去，还唔是讲什么人是朋友，什么人是敌人，所以这点呢，我对这个希拉里有信心啦。
OK， 我想多时间到我想非常感谢这场的这个讨论啦。我是个人感觉 尤其是这个 Professor Auer 伊的这个论文的重点我感觉2点咱真正爱注意啦。第一个重点就是讲，伫这个世界的这个权力斗争啦甲区域的斗争这个alliance 这个迄个同盟关系的建立真重要，尤其是咱台湾这个小所在你若讲要家己完全独立啦完全迄个neutral 我想这个是会使讲，但是这个实现性到什么程度真有问题。我是感觉你呢，咱台湾甲美国甲日本的关系，若无深入去建立这个关系，尤其是这个 Professor Auer 伊的经验，伫70年代、80年代，就是美国甲日本的这个合作，靠办法抵挡这个 Cold War 迄个冷战伫这个亚太地区大乱啦。所以这点我是感觉咱台湾爱真正去想。第二点就是讲，你这个同盟啦，政治也是军事同盟唔是干那讲的啦，爱有实力啦。我是真感动伊的迄个讲伊的经验，就是讲70年代、80年代、90年代，美国甲日本的合作，尤其是伫这个海军的合作，靠办法抵挡这个迄个苏联甲中国的这个潜水艇打破这第一海链甲第二海链所以我是感觉台湾真正爱想这个代志啦。迄个 Paris 这是老朋友都定定在交换这个意见伊对美国的迄个评论甲批评我拢真同意啦。但是我定定在想啦，你台湾本身啦，尤其是这个行政权啦，这个1月16选举了后是这个政党轮替，政党轮替的意义伫倒？咱台湾人民2300万的期待是啥物？我感觉这个真重要。我是感觉或者目前的这个真侪代志这走向拢甲咱的这个选举的期待、政权轮替的期待无啥共款啦。尤其是讲对这南海的问题啦，即摆咱这政策讲泛的讲国际法什么迄拢会通啦但是实际这个执行的时候，爱搁较具体化尤其是咱即摆讲咱有什么东海啦、南海啦、中海这个观念甲11段线甲9段线是毋是搁再混在一起啦尤其是咱即摆讲这个迄个国际仲裁，咱东南亚的国家拢支持，美国日本拢支持，咱无要支持，咱反对，这意义伫倒？我是感觉这个咱台湾爱家己反省我是感觉那台湾的将来啦，台湾人民、台湾政府家己无反省去采取积极的政策我是讲敢若日本要帮忙，美国要帮忙都有困难所以要自救爱家己先救啦。若无我是感觉或者较悲观这场的演讲we are very grateful for both presenters for this panel. I think we have learned a lot, and we are most grateful for your participation. And we have more to go this afternoon. Sure. Yeah. Please.
I think Dr. Paris Chang knows the United States better than me. So he might be correct that Hillary Clinton is certainly going to be elected president. But it's not 100% certain. This election, you may know, is very strange. And nobody is sure how many women are going to vote, how many minorities are going to vote, how many men are going to vote. So it's possible Donald Trump will be elected. If Donald Trump is elected, I will tell you that the U.S. policy to China and U.S. policy to Philippines will get better. He's a businessman, and he will make a deal. So if Hillary is elected, please follow his advice, and we'll have a better policy. But if Donald Trump is elected, I think we will also have a better policy. So you don't have to worry about American elections.
Well, this is really a challenging question because earlier it was raised in the Philippines. you have the emergence of President Duterte. And now, you know, in the United States, I hope Paris will be right, but we just cannot be sure. And for this session, I think we have very good presentation as well as interaction, and we are very grateful for our two presenters. Let's clap our hand to appreciate their participation.
Thank you, Professor Auer, Dr. Gao, and Dr. Chang. Before we get into our lunch section, I have two things to say to everyone. If you enjoy our symposium so far, please support us by donating us. And with your donation, we can go further and grow stronger and do more research on Asian Pacific peace and security.